I think in a way this was good, my stuff coming at the end, because we've had some really good like examples and illustrations of the real like tangible importance of this stuff. And I suppose I'm going to talk about some of the more invisible things that you might need to have in place, particularly around working as a group. So often these kind of projects are led by groups of people rather than one person who employs a bunch of people, for example, which can have its own challenges and benefits. And also around how you access land. So some of the kind of more invisible types of infrastructure that you might need to think about. So I'm from an organisation called Shared Assets. We are all about reimagining what we can do with land together. And that takes lots and lots of different forms. We believe that at its heart, land is a common good and we should treat it as such. And that land is something that's deeply fundamental to both social and environmental and economic justice. We do lots of different things. We do consultancy work with landowners and also work with community groups and organisations who are managing land. We do quite a lot of research. We're increasingly involved in trying to build a movement for justice in the land system. And in fact, half my team is off today in Dorset hosting a retreat for coordinators of land justice movements. So we kind of work across the whole piece, but everything we're really trying to do is about supporting what we call common good land use. And I won't run through all of these things, but I think community nature projects and the types of things that people have been talking about today fit really squarely within this. And for me, at its heart, it all comes back to supporting different ways of helping people create replenishing relationships between themselves and the environment. And that can come in lots of different forms. So what I'm going to talk about today is briefly touch on, some of the things around working as a group and what that looks like, as opposed to working in, like I say, as a sort of a sole trader or a sole entrepreneur. Think a little bit about the types of models and the associated kinds of tenure or agreements you might need over a piece of land in order to achieve those models. I'm going to very briefly touch on things you might want to consider around incorporating your group and setting yourself up as a legal entity, and then a little bit about the dynamics that might arise as you're working in a group. So this will be a very surface level kind of skim over each of these issues, but hopefully will give people enough tips to have a sense of what questions they might need to be asking themselves. So we always like to start with, I'm just actually going to flip all these things on so we don't need to faff around. There you go. Okay. Always like to start with asking the question, why? We've stolen this why, how, what kind of framework from a guy called Simon Sinek, who has a TED talk and is quite a slick kind of business consultant person. And his whole thing is every business needs to start with why. And I think that's doubly true for every community project. Really being clear with you and the people that you're working with, why you are doing something can help to sidestep a whole heap of conflict later on down the line. And I find this framework of like, why are we doing it? How are we doing it? And then what are we doing? Actually much, much easier to work with than thinking, what's our vision? What's our mission? Which can all get a little bit hazy. And so often you get people saying, well, our vision is to produce sustainable food, for example. And you're like, well, that's an activity. That's what you do. And actually, round the table in your group, you could have some people for whom producing sustainable food is hugely important because they love gardening and they love that connection with nature. And some people for whom producing sustainable food is important because they want to repudiate the existing capitalist system, and this is their easiest way of doing it. And both of those people can work really well together on producing sustainable food. But if they haven't had a conversation about their own motivations and the kind of collective motivation of the group, when, I don't know, an opportunity comes up to partner with Tesco's or something, you might suddenly find that there's some quite deep and passionate disagreement that you weren't expecting. So I don't think everybody needs to be coming from the same motivational purpose, but you do need to understand where everyone in your group is coming from. And also, if you can have some kind of collective shared purpose, that makes everything much, much easier when you're starting to have decisions to make, which as you go down the road of trying to get access to land and make something happen, you will have some decisions to make. So that's why I suppose my first thing that I say to everybody is really think about your why. The next thing, obviously, is in the what's. And there's a huge spectrum of possibility models around how community organisations can be involved with land and be involved with land in a way that supports nature. And on this spectrum, there's a huge amount of different kind of activities and things you could do. And again, there's no right answer here. Like all of these things along the spectrum, from oversight, acting maybe like as a fairly traditional friends group might, right down to taking on a lease on a piece of land. All of those are completely legitimate, but they require potentially different legal structures. They might need different skills. And again, if in your group one person's motivation is to have something they do a day a week to help liven up their retirement, and somebody else's motivation is actually to create a livelihood for themselves, those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. But if you haven't kind of talked about where everybody would like to take these things, that's where you can get some conflict. So I find these kind of different categories quite helpful in terms of where might you want to be on this spectrum? And also, where are you now? And is that really where you want to be? Often if you're negotiating, say, with a local authority for access to their land or another type of landowner, they might want to put you in one place, and actually you might want to be in a different one. And again, there's no right answer, but having a kind of a framework for that conversation can, I think, be helpful. A kind of another way of looking at that same thing really is thinking, sort of looking at it from a slightly different angle, is what level of involvement in a site would you like to have? Actually, are you all like, I'm the secretary of our local Friends of the Park group, and we're really all about doing the litter pick and a bit of weeding, like to do a bulb planting session every year. And there's probably not that much capacity, desire, or time to really be thinking about, we want to get involved in strategically working with the park service around the future of this park. It's a fairly small park. It just needs a little bit of livening up and a bit of love. But actually, if what you're wanting to do is take on a piece of derelict land and transform it into a community garden, then you probably need to be up here and thinking about governance and thinking about setting strategy. I find also this framework is quite useful when you're working within your group, especially when it's a small group, and recognizing it can often be really easy to mix up these different layers when you're having conversations or you're in meetings. And so I find often you need a different sort of mindset when you're thinking about operational matters than when you're thinking about big strategic governance decision-making matters. And so it can be helpful, even just as you're working in a group, to be like, oh, is this a governance conversation or is this an operations conversation? Again, something that might be useful if you're negotiating with a landowner is to think about, if you're thinking at one of these levels, what does that mean in terms of the type of arrangement or agreement that you might want to have? And I can send these slides to Nina so she can share them afterwards, so you don't need to worry about scribbling all of this down. But yeah, I think being really clear, often when you're negotiating with a landowner, that you're sort of talking at different levels on this diagram. And that is, again, a place where sort of conflict and wasted time can really ensue. And then, really thinking about tenure, which is the fancy name for the bundle of rights that are attached to a piece of land. And there's lots of different ways that you can have a legal relationship with a piece of land in this country, and all of them are suitable for various different things. But again, it really comes back to being clear about what it is you want to do and kind of what your aspirations are for the long term. And again, who the landowner is that you're negotiating with. if you're wanting to invest, for example, if you're wanting to create a community garden that does need some kind of infrastructure, you're going to need some kind of medium to long-term security. If you're actually wanting to recreate a forest, then you're almost definitely going to need some long-term security, because like trees take a really long time to grow. However, if what you're trying to do is more along the incredible edible, brightening things up, planting things all over the place, maybe you don't need any kind of agreement at all. And often I think, particularly again, when you're negotiating with local authorities, they can be trying to put you into a box, often a 25-year lease for some reason, which might actually not suit your needs at all. So again, being clear about what you need and then starting to think about what your options might be from there is important. Getting access to land is one of the key things. Sometimes there is a site that just comes up on your doorstep and that's great, but often people are, and sometimes it's the site that drives the project. So people are interested in the piece of land because of what it is, and that is what creates a sort of a motivation and a kind of momentum around a project. But often you will have a group of people who want to do something but don't necessarily have a site on which to do it. There's just a few tips here. Getting access to land in the UK is a really tricky thing. 70% of the land is owned by less than 1% of the population. We have a hugely centralised a centralised system where land is the proxy for power and wealth. And so it doesn't come on the market very often. And when it does, it can be very, very expensive. But this is why often people look to work with their local councils and try and get public land of some kind. Again, really important to understand, if you're trying to do that, like what you need and what would make a site suitable for you. And if there will be local policies you're supporting, whether it's because your council has declared a climate emergency or whether you're going to be doing healthy activities with kids that will help them meet some of their other outcomes, being really clear about that. Being patient and also trying to understand the needs of the landowner. There's various different community rights frameworks that you can use to sort of force conversations with local authorities, but often if you're able to go with solutions to their problems, you end up with a better relationship. Very briefly, legal structures. So if you're a group of people sitting around a kitchen table with an idea, what you are is just a group of people sitting around a kitchen table. And under the law, you are a group of individual people. You can create a group, you can even register as a charity, and you can create a constitution and open a bank account. But in legal terms, you are each individual people, and you are legally responsible as individual people. And for many projects, that's absolutely fine, because what you're doing doesn't incur much risk. If you start to enter into contracts, whether that's to employ people or to run larger events or to acquire a piece of land, like sign a lease, it can be incredibly useful to incorporate, which literally means to create a legal person in the form of a company or a charitable incorporated organization or a community interest company or a cooperative that essentially is another body sitting around that table with you. What that legal vehicle, that legal body should be really depends on what it is you're trying to do. Form should follow function. And there's quite a lot of guidance on the internet about what the pros and cons of various different structures. I'm aware of time, so I won't run through these questions, but those are the questions you should be asking yourselves, because they will help you define what kind of legal structure you need. And then whether you have a legal structure or not, you're going to need people, you're going to need people with various different skills and various different attributes. I feel like I just went over a slide here. Sorry, there. And so everyone's kind of familiar with this idea of groups need a chair and a secretary and a treasurer. And to be honest, yeah, you need someone to keep hold of your meetings. You need somebody to do your money. But I'm not sure you really need to worry so much about those roles, as opposed to be thinking about the kind of more informal roles and skills and attributes that you need. And recognizing and sort of celebrating the fact that there will be people with different personalities who are bringing different sort of attributes and aspects to your group. Some of those things are here. The questioner / challenger role is really important. And one thing that kind of group dynamic theory tells us is that almost every group has a naysayer, has somebody whose kind of almost role it is in the group is to be like, oh, that's not going to work. And often if they leave, somebody else takes on that role. And it's a really, really important one and something that should be celebrated. And yeah, you need these kind of other types of skills and attributes as well. And yeah, just to think big. It's important to be ambitious. Sometimes this stuff can be daunting, but it is all very possible.